All right, Democrats have reached, I think, the obvious conclusion that their only path, sure path to victory, is the burn-it-all-down approach of the neo-Bolsheviks on the streets. Joe Biden's team has formed common cause with those who not only seek the destruction of the nuclear family. If you don't believe me, check out BLM's website. They've actually decided that promoting racial hatred is the only way they can win. They know that Trump's policies, it's obvious, have delivered results for working people of all races, while theirs have largely failed. Now, the left hopes that by inflaming racial division and hiding their candidate, they could avoid a real debate on the issues. So over the weekend, the president responded with two powerful speeches to celebrate our independence and identify the domestic forces now threatening it. His remarks at Mount Rushmore reaffirmed America's identity and inspired millions of Americans who've basically been living in despair because of the one-two punch of the virus and the continuing riots.
These radicals would tear down the very heritage for which men gave their lives to win the Civil War. They would tear down the principles that propelled the abolition of slavery and ultimately around the world, ending an evil institution that had plagued humanity for thousands and thousands of years. Our opponents would tear apart the very documents that Martin Luther King used to express his dream. They would tear down the beliefs, culture, and identity that have made America the most vibrant and tolerant society in the history of the earth. We will proclaim the ideals of the Declaration of Independence, and we will never surrender the spirit and the courage and the cause of July 4th, 1776. Upon this ground, we will stand firm and unwavering in the face of lies meant to divide us, demoralize us, and diminish us.
Now, you can always tell how effective one of the president's speeches is by how frenzied the reaction from liberals.
I actually thought it was some fantasy. He's just desperate.
There was a lot about history, about God and our great country, much of it very ominous.
There was no attempt here to unify the country. It was just a divisive message.
The president threw down the cultural war gauntlet in defense of dead white men.
Inflammatory, hateful, watching it, you realize how disturbed and how disturbing this president really is.
You notice I described liberals, and Kasich and Jennifer Rubin are among them? You bet. Now, if lying was an Olympic sport, these folks would be draped in gold medals. In moments of rare candor, they know that Trump beats Biden hands down on jobs and wages for African Americans. Trump beats Biden on education. He favors liberation for parents and students who are stuck in bad schools. Trump beat Biden on prison reform. Obama and Biden both talked a good game. They didn't get it done. And of course, Trump has done something that Biden never did. He has actually hired and promoted African Americans and other minorities across as many businesses. Now, where Biden and Democrats are content to patronize African Americans with these meaningless symbolic gestures, conservatives actually believe that minorities want what all people want: a fair chance at prosperity and to pursue their happiness in freedom and safety. Trump knows this is only possible with a vibrant, growing economy where all criminals are prosecuted. Meanwhile, Biden thinks he can surf to victory on racial anger stoked by mobs, many of whom are white, who would rather see every city in America burn than a second Trump term. Now, this requires a massive effort to lie and defame, one that an honest press would have exposed long ago. Now, as I've said before, instead of covering the Democrats, the media cover for them. Their tactics and their toxic associations I'm talking about. So long as the end game of any activist or politician is to rid America of Trump, the press will excuse all manner of falsehoods, hypocrisy, and even criminality. So to stoke racial tension, the Biden campaign requires a massive effort to lie and defame, one that, of course, would have already been exposed long ago. Now, when you think back, when you think about how this whole thing went down, how did it go down? It went down after this long shutdown. People had a lot of time on their hands. Again, if we continue to allow these lies and this ongoing slander and defamation to continue, well, what happens? People will continue to lose faith in the system of laws and even in equal protection.
You know, looters got a bad name during the, George Floyd protests, but thank goodness for the looters, man. You have a place called Target. You have a store called Target. You're going to be a target. These places have absolutely contributed to the oppression.
Now, the left is even trying to get the Broadway sensation Hamilton canceled. If you think that's wacky, it is. That's right. There is a cancel Hamilton hashtag out there. Now, never mind that all the key roles, including those of Alexander Hamilton and George Washington, are played by people of color in the musical. Critics say it glosses over key facts. They claim Hamilton was not an abolitionist and traded slaves for his in-laws. The mere fact that it celebrates the founding era in any positive way to good music is ample reason for the left to call for its cancellation. Now, the only thing at this point that's sacred to them is the notion that if you're a leftist, you cannot be questioned or prosecuted for crimes. Yeah, ends justify the means? You bet they do. Past grievances mean never having to say you're sorry. The media will give you a pass for anything. At the same time, they spy racism around every corner.
Smollett says he was assaulted by two masked men who yelled out racial and homophobic slurs. Police are investigating the incident as a possible hate crime.
A horrifying racist incident.
Heinous.
Ugly.
Crude and cowardly way.
Hate crime.
NASCAR is investigating a horrible incident.
A noose was found in the garage stall of Bubba Wallace.
Much as NASCAR may try to distance itself from that, it's a living, breathing part of their sport.
Oh, and then when Trump calls him on it, albeit via an inartfully worded tweet, he becomes the target.
Do you believe the president sees racism as a potential path to re-election?
Look, there's no doubt that, and I've said this before, this president, his political calculus is all about division, not addition.
And why does the left do all this? Well, simple. To deflect from the Democrats' own horrific record on race, the economy, and crime.
This is now a third week in a row where we have seen children shot and killed here. It's part of a weekend where we saw more than 60 people shot and over a dozen people killed. So just point blank, what is happening right now?
The ecosystem of public safety that isn't just law enforcement, but is local, community-based, and they too have really been hit hard by COVID and are now just kind of coming back online and getting their footing.
What? Did you just hear that? Chicago's seen a tragic level of violence since the Black Lives Matter marches started. And it's claiming African-American lives and costing the black community dearly. The bad guys here aren't the folks going to Mount Rushmore. They're criminals murdering children on the streets of our nation's third largest city. 80 people were shot and 17 killed in Chicago last weekend alone, and at least 13 of those were African-American. And it gets even more tragic. Including among the dead is a 7-year-old, Natalia Wallace. She was shot in the head. She was visiting her grandmother for the 4th of July. And sadly, she wasn't the only child killed. In Southeast D.C., 11-year-old Devon McNeil, shot and killed at a 4th of July cookout with his family. Armed thugs in Atlanta murdered 8-year-old Secoria Turner near the Wendy's where Rayshard Brooks died at the hands of police. Now, this is senseless and awful killing, and it's obviously left her parents heartbroken, shattered, and asking why.
They say Black Lives Matter. You killed your own. Killed your own this time. Just because of barrier. They killed my baby because she crossed the barrier and made a U-turn. You killed a child. She ain't do nothing to nobody.
Now, every single one of these cities is run by Democrats. And rather than addressing violent crime, drugs, and fatherlessness plaguing so many communities, they just make excuses. They throw out phrases like systemic racism, unconscious bias, or white privilege, and minimizing the importance of personal responsibility, love of one's neighbor, and the value of every human life. So rather than insisting on law and order, safety in every community, including African American communities, this is the best they can offer.
We talk about systemic racism and the trauma and the anxiety, and you think about the leadership or the lack thereof that we have coming from the highest office in the land. I think that you are seeing so many emotions play out, and so too often it's playing out in violence in our streets.
Emotions are playing out? I think some folks are still trying to pretend that all of this mayhem will stop if we just let the Democrats have the White House. Well, we have the Democrats in power in Atlanta, in Chicago, in New York, in Baltimore, and beyond and beyond. What's happened? So this thinking is foolish and naive. The Democrats have shown they're utterly unwilling to restrain the hard left from seizing property and committing violence. And as for the culture wars, why would the radicals stop when they think they're winning? So ignore the folks who say that it just gets better when we let the Democrats have more power. The only way this situation gets better is for Democrats to lose, and lose so often that they're forced to apologize for their relentless slandering of our nation's history, and by extension, the majority of our citizens who still unapologetically love this country and still believe that it's worth celebrating. And that's the angle. Now, if a tree falls in a forest and no one's around to hear it, does it make a sound? Well, that's the age-old philosophical thought experiment about perception and observation. But after this weekend, we can modify it this way. If a Trump march draws tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of peaceful, patriotic people to Washington, and no one's around to report it, did it really occur? Well, it was billed as the Million MAGA March. That's more than tens of thousands. And you look at it by the overhead shots, it could be one of the biggest grassroots protests the Capitol has ever seen. Attendees were families, young, old, black, white, Hispanic. They came from near and far, all to support the America First agenda and to stand with the man who has endured so much in order to lead the movement.
Winning Trump forever. For the very first time, I voted. And I voted for Donald J. Trump.
He's fought for us through thick and thin. He's been bombarded with one thing after another, you know, and the American people know it, you know, and you can see by the support.
We got to make sure our president get back in that office 4 more years.
Now, it's a fair guess that most in that gigantic crowd are convinced that Trump won the election. And it's likewise reasonable for them to conclude that they don't have much trust in the U.S. media. Now, pockets, by the way, were even chanting against this news channel for what they perceive as election night bias against the president. Others were rightfully outraged that few networks were even carrying the rally at all. And the ones who did were only interested in insulting the attendees.
The president's supporters, they've poured into the streets of Washington this weekend to try to give life to these unfounded and baseless claims of a rigged election. How did this become normal?
I think with some of these demonstrators, good luck getting a clear or fact-based, logical answer to some of the questions you're posing.
These people are fundamentally a joke. These aren't serious people. These are members of a cult. I hope they get frostbite.
I hope they get frostbite, is what he said. Now, remember, these talking heads are some of the kind, tolerant, unifying, and loving people that Biden and Harris claim make up their movement. Well, 73 million people voted for President Trump, and it's not too much for them to expect, is it, that the media treat them fairly and respectfully. Likewise, it's not too much for them to expect that only legal votes will be counted. and that their votes must not be nullified due to fraud. Now, for years now, I've been speaking about this type of honest, hardworking Americans who came to Washington over the weekend. And throughout this time, the so-called elites in our nation's capital have responded to the legitimate concerns of American citizens with mockery and contempt. It's dumbfounding to me that the media and Democrats still don't understand what a stupid strategy it is to alienate and dismiss all of these Americans. I think they're making the same mistake they made back in 2009 and 2010 when the much smaller Tea Party movement started.
You see the Tea Party movement as a real political force this year?
Look, it seems to be a very successful private enterprise.
Nobody actually knows what they're for. We just know what they are against.
It's not about taxes. This is about hating a black man in the White House.
We call it AstroTurf. It's not really a grassroots movement.
Those of you who are watching certain news channels that on which I'm not very popular, and you see folks waving tea bags around.
They thought that all that condescension would make the movement go away. But it only made the Tea Party stronger. Less than 2 years after those insults, Republicans took control of the House in 2010. Now, some of the Tea Party candidates included those little-known people, Kristi Noem, Marco Rubio, Ted Cruz, Rand Paul, Tim Scott, and Mike Lee. And 4 years later, the GOP took control of the Senate. 2 years after that, Donald Trump was elected president. Now, the difference between the Tea Party then and President Trump's movement now is that this movement now has a lot more clarity about what it wants. The same Trump economic and foreign policy agenda that led to higher wages, fewer wars. And whatever the final Electoral College tally is in this election, this movement has a proven track record of success on everything from achieving our energy independence to challenging China, to fast-tracking a COVID vaccine, to raising family incomes. The results were so impressive that not only did President Trump broaden his coalition among working-class Americans, but he helped grow the party's numbers in the House. When all those vaunted media experts with all their credentials were predicting the opposite. They claimed Trump was going to shrink the party, remember that? Especially among minorities. Wrong again.
Blacks and Latinos are doing much better under Trump versus Obama.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Opportunity zones, which is something that, in my opinion, is the largest economic empowerment program for the black community since probably Reconstruction.
We've done a lot of things, and I've been seeing a lot of business come to my neighborhood. I've been seeing a lot of black people own homes.
Why couldn't the networks find these people to interview? They were there. We found them. In a Biden administration, that you just saw, all those gains, are going to be flushed down the toilet. His handlers, who are basically all the old Obama staffers, believe in something called the Great Reset of capitalism. I told you about this last week. It's a plan to force a more equitable distribution of global resources. Translation, most Americans will have less freedom and less money, except for the same elites who always find a way around the rules. Like during the lockdowns, when the families of these mini tyrants skirted the restrictions. Just last week, California Governor Gavin Newsom was dining with a prohibited number of pals at that exclusive restaurant, the French Laundry. Chicago Mayor Lori Lightfoot was caught partying maskless in a massive crowd celebrating Biden's unofficial election win. No problem at all. And Pelosi, well, she was going to have a big congressional soiree until she was shamed into canceling it. The American people are onto these frauds. The MAGA marchers certainly couldn't have been clearer about what COVID lockdowns and restrictions have done to America.
It's like, and what Trump said in the beginning, the cure can't be worse than the disease itself. People, we still need to go on.
We're trying to finish off any business that was able to hang on by the skin of their teeth, and the last closures, they'll finish them off.
People are hurting. Nancy Pelosi, Joe Biden, they all talk about caring about the American people, but you shut this country down for 4 to 6 weeks, and you're going to it'll be the final nail in the coffin for a lot of small businesses.
100% true. But so far, Joe Biden and his handlers aren't listening. Biden loves to talk about dignity and unity and respect. But the time for talk is over and the time for action is here. Because if Biden really wanted to unite the country, he wouldn't even be entertaining the idea of destroying our current economic recovery with another devastating lockdown or series of lockdowns. If Biden really wanted to unite the country, he would not dismiss the concerns of tens of millions of Americans about mail-in voting. Instead, he'd do something like, I don't know, appoint a bipartisan commission to answer every question about how this election was conducted and to make certain that we will never have to wait so long for an accurate count. And if Joe Biden really wanted to unite the country, he would have personally and on camera condemn the BLM and Antifa thugs who beat, kicked, and harassed Trump supporters on Saturday. He has done none of these things. He still hopes this movement's just going to go away. But that's not going to happen. Here are a few hard truths for Joe Biden, his handlers, and his enablers in the press corps. You know who you are. The pro-Trump throngs didn't show up in D.C. on Saturday because of conservative media, because we told them to. They showed up knowing they could be physically attacked for doing so because they love America. And lying about them, insulting them, ignoring them will only incite more violence and more resentment and opposition. All Americans deserve to be heard, to be seen, and to be safe. It's the least a government can do for its citizens. And that's the angle. But if the press were actually doing its job, you'd be hearing a lot about the Bloomberg New Economy Forum, which has been going on all week, attended by modern-day global leaders and wealthy elites who supported Joe Biden. And they're so confident in their agenda, so buoyed by what they see as the defeat of the America First movement, that they aren't even trying to hide their disdain any longer for American sovereignty.
Were you surprised by how badly America has done on that? Very quickly.
Oh, it's mind-blowing.
When the Paris Agreement came into force, the United States withdrew from it and left us and all the other countries around the world disappointed.
The marketplace is encouraged by having a leader now that is more inclusive.
Inclusive. Of course, if they have their way, you're going to have no say in the future of the global economy, no way to affect it, no ability to change it. It's up to American patriots to oppose what they're trying to do at almost every turn. And that means supporting Senators Kelly Loeffler and David Perdue in Georgia in that runoff on January 5th. And it means keeping pressure on Republican elected officials across the board. I mean, let's face it, before Trump, a lot of them were wrong on both trade and immigration. Got to keep an eye on them. And over the next 4 years, these Republicans are going to come under enormous media and financial pressure to appease the global elites. And make no mistake about it, the globalists are determined to ram through their agenda. And given Biden's age and mental acuity, or lack thereof, they probably feel like they have a very narrow window, very short window to achieve their grand designs. If Biden gets into office, get ready for the fight of your life over the next years. At every turn, they will try to subvert your rights and take your prosperity. To start, they're going to crater your personal finances with insane climate policies.
We need a whole economy transition, backing those who are part of the solution and taking capital away from those who are part of the problem.
A cap and trade mechanism or some kind of carbon tax.
An active carbon market with a carbon price that would continue to step up in level every year.
Guaranteed tax increases on energy would devastate the middle class, but they know that. The elites know that. That's their entire point, remember? Now, we made an appeal to AOC to work with us to stop some of these types of crushing globalist deals. But Bloomberg and his pals are really smart. They know exactly the kind of rhetoric that's needed to win people like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez over.
Climate change is going to kill us all. If we're waiting for things to be delivered in 2050, we're not going to be around to see them.
Well, we don't have a lot of time. It's somewhere between 10 and 20 years. We need to invest now.
We don't have
10 or 12 years to build new power stations. We need them in 18 months.
On trade, which we highlighted earlier this week, Bloomberg and his globalist cronies made clear in a special report what their overriding goal is: sticking together by guarding against the risk of the U.S. and China decoupling. Oh, they don't want that. Bloomberg and lots of other American plutocrats have billions tied up in China. So decoupling from the communist regime would be a disaster for them personally, even though it would be a huge boon to American industries and American workers. Now, on COVID, billionaires like Bill Gates could barely hide their excitement for what a Biden presidency might bring.
As people come into the country, do they have a digital certificate that says whether they've been vaccinated or not? As the U.S. rejoins the WHO, this idea of what does the vaccine certificate look like, hopefully that dialogue will begin.
Show me your papers. Now, don't for a second think that you're going to have a seat at that table for this dialogue. You're just supposed to sit down and do what you're told, remember? Well, that's what Dr. Fauci told us anyway. Coincidentally, the Chinese CDC's chief epidemiologist had basically the same message yesterday.
In the Eastern culture, we have a community value is higher than the individual value. In the United States and European countries, the personal right is the top priority. The most important is everybody takes the order and follow the instruction.
Everyone take the order and follow the instruction, or else do what you're told. Mask up, open your wallet, distance, get the vaccine certificate, give up your freedom, your autonomy, and do not under any circumstances ask any real questions. Doesn't that sound like a fun world to live in? Well, this is the type of mentality that will guide the Biden administration's COVID response. And of course, good old Joel will bend over backwards to appease the World Health Organization, a prospect that has emboldened World Health Organization head doctor Tedros.
The fastest way out of this pandemic is for us to work together in solidarity across sectors and across borders. Vaccine nationalism will prolong the pandemic. The pandemic has taken so much from us, but it has also given us something, the opportunity to think afresh about the world we want. We can build the healthier, safer, and fairer world we all want and build back better.
There it is. You think it's any coincidence that Tedros is borrowing Biden's campaign slogan, or who's borrowing from whom these days? It's a signal that they're all on the same team. They all have the same end goals. Individualism and individual rights will be subverted, sublimated to the global rights, the communal rights. And it's a sign that Joe Biden won't put America first. He's not out to make America better, and he won't make that his first priority. He's got to do the bidding of Bloomberg, Wall Street, big business, and the rest of the special interests that bankrolled his campaign. And of course that means kowtowing to the elites who don't give a damn about jobs and wages for Americans. They never did. That's why it's imperative that we hold the Senate next year. Because with a majority in that chamber, plus our gains in the House, we actually have a chance at thwarting this kind of takeover of the levers of power from our government to a government far, far away. And we can make sure that the America First movement continues to deliver results that our citizens and we can use to build a future where our children can actually thrive under the system of government and with our inalienable rights that we all love and cherish. And that's the angle.